Hey guys, tonight we begin with the chaotic streets of ancient Rome, a world where politics wasn't debated. It was beaten into submission with clubs, bricks, and occasionally very enthusiastic fists. Rome was not built for peace, quiet, or anything resembling personal comfort. By the late Republic, the city had ballooned into a crowded, noisy, slightly unstable experiment in how many humans you can stack into one place before things start going creatively wrong. Over 1 million people squeezed into tight streets and even tighter buildings, all trying to live, work, argue, and occasionally breathe at the same time. Most people lived in insulae, tall apartment blocks that leaned with the confidence of a man who has had just enough wine to believe he's fine. These buildings were cheap, cramped, and prone to collapsing, which really kept life exciting. Fires were common, water was unreliable, and if you lived on the upper floors, your daily workout included climbing stairs and contemplating your life choices. Down at street level, things didn't calm down. They got worse. The streets were loud, chaotic, and constantly moving. Vendors shouted over each other, carts rattled past, animals wandered freely, and somewhere nearby at all times, at least 2 Romans were arguing like it was an Olympic sport. There was no such thing as a quiet walk. There was only walking. And then there was aggressively being part of everyone else's day. And now the fun part, Rome didn't have a real police force. There were guards, technically, night watchmen, patrols, officials, but they were few, underpaid, and deeply committed to the ancient Roman tradition of not getting involved unless absolutely necessary. If a fight broke out, they might step in. Eventually, after carefully evaluating whether they also wanted to be punched, so fights weren't rare. They were practically scheduled. Tension lived everywhere. The rich lived in luxury, the poor lived in survival mode, and both groups shared the same streets, which historically has never gone wrong. Add in political rivalries, personal grudges, and the general Roman enthusiasm for dramatic reactions, and you had a city constantly one bad mood away from chaos. And chaos, if you give it time, becomes organized. This is where the gangs begin. At first, they were just groups of followers, clients, freedmen, and anyone who needed protection or a steady source of food. Loyalty wasn't philosophical, it was practical. If a powerful patron fed you, protected you, and occasionally pointed at someone and said, "That guy is a problem," you understood the assignment. Because in Rome, power didn't end in the Senate. It continued outside, with sticks, and slowly, almost naturally, the city turned into something else. A place where law existed in theory, but in practice, control belonged to whoever showed up with more friends and less patience. So now you're living in Rome, a city packed with people, tension, and buildings that occasionally try to retire mid-use. Naturally, you might assume there's some kind of system keeping everything under control. There is. It's just not very good. Rome technically had officials responsible for maintaining order. There were vigils, night watchmen who were supposed to deal with fires and basic disturbances. Think of them as a mix between firefighters, security guards, and very tired men who did not sign up for whatever was about to happen. The problem? There weren't nearly enough of them, and more importantly, they weren't exactly feared. If a serious fight broke out, the vigils might show up, but not with the authority or numbers needed to actually stop it. Their main advantage was carrying a torch, which was useful for seeing the chaos more clearly as it unfolded. During the day, things weren't much better. Magistrates and officials technically held power, but enforcement relied heavily on personal influence. If you were important, laws worked for you. If you weren't, laws were more like polite suggestions written on very expensive scrolls. So if someone robbed you, attacked you, or smashed your shop, your options were limited. You could report it. You could complain. Or you could accept that the person who did it probably had more friends than you. And that last part mattered. Because in a city with weak enforcement, power doesn't disappear. It relocates. Instead of law controlling the streets, individuals did. Wealthy patrons, ambitious politicians, and influential families began gathering followers. Not just for status, but for protection. If you had enough loyal men around you, problems tended to solve themselves. Or at least move to someone else. And those men weren't just decorative. They were expected to act, to escort, to intimidate, to intervene, sometimes very enthusiastically. Over time, these groups stopped being casual entourages and started becoming something more structured, more organized, more willing to use force. Because here's the reality. If no one is enforcing the rules, then the rules are negotiable. And in Rome, negotiation often looked a lot like being surrounded by 10 very motivated individuals who strongly encouraged you to change your opinion, quickly. So the absence of strong policing didn't create peace. It created opportunity, and as more people realized that influence could be built with loyalty, numbers, and a willingness to get their hands dirty, the streets began to shift, not into lawlessness, but into something far more efficient. Privatized control? Because why rely on the state to protect you when you can just build your own system and skip the waiting time entirely? So by this point, Rome has a population problem, a tension problem, and a no one is really in charge out here problem. Naturally, this is where things become organized, because humans are very good at two things: forming groups and immediately using those groups to deal with other groups. What began as loose circles of followers around powerful men slowly evolved into something far more structured. These weren't random crowds anymore. They were networks, built on loyalty, dependency, and the occasional promise of food that wasn't slightly burnt. In Roman society, there was already a system called patronage. A wealthy patron would support clients, offering protection, money, or influence. And in return, those clients gave loyalty, public support, and the occasional favour. Normally, that favour meant showing up to clap at speeches. Now it meant showing up ready to throw hands. Because as competition for power intensified, patrons realised something important. Influence wasn't just about how many people supported you. It was about how many people were willing to stand behind you and look intimidating while doing it. So these groups grew. Slaves, freedmen, unemployed citizens, and anyone with limited options but strong arms became part of these entourages. Not because they loved politics, but because politics suddenly paid better than doing nothing. And once these groups formed, they didn't just stand around looking impressive. They acted. They escorted their patrons through the streets like human shields. They occupied public spaces. They made sure rival speakers had a less than ideal experience delivering their messages. Sometimes the message didn't get delivered at all, because the speaker was busy reconsidering his life choices. At first, this might have looked like exaggerated loyalty, but over time it became something else entirely. These were no longer followers. They were street forces, organized, directed, and increasingly aggressive. And the more one powerful figure built such a group, the more others felt the need to do the same. Because in Rome, being the only person without a gang was less of a moral stance and more of a strategic mistake. So slowly, almost inevitably, the city transformed. Public space was no longer neutral ground. It was territory. And territory, as it turns out, is something people get very serious about, especially when losing it means losing influence, power, and possibly your ability to walk home without being introduced to a stick at high speed. So now the streets are full of organized groups, each tied to powerful men, each very loyal, and each increasingly comfortable with solving problems in ways that would not look great in a Senate transcript. Naturally, it was only a matter of time before politics followed them outside, because inside the Senate, arguments were still happening the traditional way. Long speeches, dramatic gestures, and the occasional passive-aggressive insult wrapped in elegant Latin. But outside things were more efficient. Public life in Rome revolved around gatherings, speeches in the forum, assemblies, elections, debates. These were supposed to be the heart of Roman democracy, where ideas were shared and decisions were made. Instead, they became opportunities. If you could control the crowd, you could control the outcome. And controlling the crowd didn't always mean convincing them. Sometimes it meant making sure the other side didn't feel comfortable staying. So gangs began showing up to political events, not quietly, not subtly, very visibly. They occupied space, stood close together, and made it clear that disagreement might lead to a deeply unpleasant afternoon. Speeches could be interrupted, opponents could be shouted down, and if things escalated, which they often did, the situation could quickly turn physical. Debates became shoving matches became fights, and fights became the main event. Imagine trying to deliver an important political speech while someone in the front row is loudly insulting you, and another group is slowly moving closer with expressions that suggest they are not here for intellectual discussion. It was less freedom of speech and more freedom to attempt speech. And here's the part that really made it effective. It worked. If your opponents couldn't safely speak, gather, or vote, their influence disappeared. Not because people stopped agreeing with them, but because showing support suddenly came with personal risk. And most people, understandably, preferred to remain alive. So politics in Rome didn't just become aggressive. It became physical. Power was no longer decided solely by persuasion or status. It was decided by presence, by numbers, by who controlled the ground beneath everyone's feet. And once that shift happens, it's very hard to reverse. Because now, winning isn't just about being right. It's about being the last one still standing, preferably without needing medical attention afterward. And just when Rome's streets were starting to feel like a poorly supervised experiment in organised chaos, along came a man who looked at the situation and thought, yes, but what if we made it worse? Professionally. Enter Publius Clodius Pulcher. Clodius wasn't just another ambitious politician trying to climb the Roman ladder. He was something far more effective and far more exhausting for everyone around him. He understood the system, and more importantly, he understood how to break it without technically breaking it. Clodius built a massive following in the streets, not just casual supporters, but a dedicated, loud, and very hands-on group of loyal men. These weren't the kind of followers who politely applauded speeches. These were the kind who made sure no one else got to speak. His power didn't come from quiet influence or backroom deals. It came from presence, from visibility, from the simple fact that if Clodius showed up somewhere, his people showed up too, and they didn't blend into the background. They took up space, made noise, and had a very clear understanding of their role in the day's events, which was usually encourage agreement, very strongly. Clodius used this street power to push through laws, disrupt rivals, and shape public opinion in ways that had very little to do with persuasion and a lot to do with pressure. Public meetings turned into controlled environments. Opponents found themselves shouted down, pushed out, or suddenly deciding they had somewhere else to be, preferably somewhere safer. And here's what made Clodius especially dangerous. He was popular, not universally loved, of course, but among the urban masses, he positioned himself as their champion. He spoke their language, supported their interests, and made them feel seen. And if that support occasionally involved breaking a few benches or chasing a few rivals out of the forum, well, details. Because in a city where survival often depended on who you knew and who stood behind you, Clodius offered something valuable: protection, belonging, and the comforting knowledge that if things went wrong, you wouldn't be alone. You'd be part of a very large group of people making things go wrong for someone else instead. So, while Rome's elites debated policies and traditions, Clodius quietly, or rather very loudly, built something far more powerful: control of the streets. And in Rome, that meant control of everything that happened on them, which, unfortunately for everyone else, was most things. So by now, Clodius isn't just participating in Rome's chaos, he's refining it. What used to be occasional clashes and spontaneous fights is slowly turning into something far more structured, almost professional. Violence is no longer a last resort. It's a tool, a reliable, repeatable, and surprisingly effective tool. Clodius and his followers didn't just react to situations, they created them. If a rival planned a public speech, Clodius's men would arrive early, take positions, and make it very clear that this event was about to have complications. And by complications, we mean shouting, pushing, and eventually someone being introduced to the ground at high speed. Public assemblies became unpredictable, not because people didn't care about politics, but because attending the wrong gathering could quickly turn into an extreme sport. And Clodius understood timing. He knew when to escalate and when to simply remind people that escalation was an option. Sometimes just showing up with enough men was enough to shift the mood of an entire crowd. You didn't need to start a fight if everyone already believed you were willing to, which in his case was not a difficult assumption to make. Opponents found themselves constantly on edge. Planning an event meant planning security. Giving a speech meant hoping your audience didn't suddenly become a moving obstacle. And traveling through the city required a level of awareness usually reserved for people avoiding very specific problems. Like organized groups of men who recognized you and didn't like you. What made this system so effective was its consistency. It kept working. Each successful disruption reinforced the idea that this was simply how things were done now. If you wanted influence, you needed presence. If you wanted presence, you needed people. And if you had people, you needed to be ready to use them, preferably before someone else used theirs. So violence stopped being shocking. It became expected, routine, almost administrative, like filing paperwork but louder and significantly more dangerous. And once a system reaches that point, where intimidation replaces debate and force replaces persuasion, it doesn't just affect politics, it reshapes the entire city. Because now, every interaction carries a question in the background. Not who is right, but who has more men nearby. And in Rome, that answer mattered more than anything else, because being right was useful, but being outnumbered was usually a short conversation. And just when it seemed like Clodius had turned Rome into his personal stage for organized disruption, Someone else looked at the situation and came to a very reasonable conclusion. This is unacceptable. I need my own version of it. Enter Titus Annius Milo. Milo wasn't interested in politely asking Clodius to stop. He wasn't going to write a strongly worded speech or hope the system would correct itself, because by this point it was very clear the system had already taken a day off. So Milo did the only logical thing available in a city where violence had become a political language. He became fluent in it. Milo began assembling his own group of loyal followers, men who could match Clodius's presence in the streets, who could push back, interrupt, and, if necessary, escalate. And unlike the earlier days of scattered violence, this wasn't reactive. This was strategic. Now, Rome didn't just have one dominant force controlling public spaces. It had two, and they did not get along. Where Clodius represented one faction, Milo stood firmly against him. Their rivalry wasn't subtle, it wasn't quiet, and it definitely wasn't contained to speeches or debates. It played out in the streets, regularly. Their supporters clashed in open confrontations, ambushes, brawls, and sudden eruptions of violence that could turn a normal day into something far more memorable than anyone had planned. If you were an ordinary Roman, your daily routine now included a new consideration. Is today a good day to leave the house? Or is this a stay inside and value your life kind of day? Because the problem wasn't just that violence existed, it was that it now had sides, organised, motivated, and constantly looking for opportunities to gain advantage. Public events became contested territory, streets became zones of influence. Even movement through the city required awareness, not just of where you were going, but of who controlled the path between you and your destination. And the presence of two competing gangs didn't balance the system. It destabilized it further, because now any moment of tension could escalate into confrontation, and any confrontation could escalate into something worse. Rome had moved past simple intimidation. It had entered open rivalry, a city divided not just by politics, but by groups of men who were very committed to proving their point with physical enthusiasm. And as you might expect, this arrangement was not heading toward a peaceful resolution. So now Rome has two organised forces, both well-funded, highly motivated, and deeply committed to the idea that compromise is for people without backup. What could possibly go wrong? At this point, the city stops feeling like a city and starts feeling like a series of territories. Not officially, of course. No sign saying Clodius controls this street, or Milo's men strongly prefer you not exist here. But everyone knew certain areas were safer depending on who you supported. Certain routes were avoided entirely. And if you accidentally wandered into the wrong space at the wrong time, you might quickly discover that geography in Rome came with consequences. Clashes between the gangs weren't rare anymore. They were expected. Ambushes happened in narrow streets where escape routes were limited, which, from a tactical perspective, was very efficient, and from a personal safety perspective, deeply unfortunate. Groups would spot each other from a distance, tensions would rise, insults would be exchanged, and within moments, the situation would escalate into a full-blown fight. And these weren't small scuffles. We're talking organised brawls with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men, all very focused on winning the argument through physical persuasion. Sticks, stones, whatever was nearby, all became part of the discussion. The city adapted in its own way. Shops would close quickly at the first sign of trouble. Bystanders learned to disappear with impressive speed. And experienced Romans developed a kind of instinct, a sixth sense for when a situation was about to go from tense to, "You should not be here." It usually started with shouting, then more shouting, then running. And if you were still standing there trying to understand what was happening, you were already behind schedule. What made this especially dangerous was the unpredictability. These weren't scheduled battles. There was no warning, no announcement, no polite reminder to avoid certain areas between specific hours. Violence could erupt anywhere, at any time. A busy market could turn into a battleground. A public gathering could dissolve into chaos. Even major roads, the lifelines of the city, were not immune. And yet life continued. Because it had to. People still worked, traded, and moved through the city, navigating this unstable environment as best they could. Carefully, cautiously, occasionally with the quiet hope that today would be uneventful. It often wasn't. Because Rome hadn't just accepted violence. It had integrated it into daily life, into politics, into movement itself. And once a city reaches that point, where conflict is no longer an interruption but part of the routine, it stops feeling temporary. It starts feeling permanent. Which, as history tends to show, is rarely a good sign. So at this point, Rome isn't just dealing with occasional violence. It's living with it. What used to be rare and shocking has now settled into something far more uncomfortable. routine. Not predictable, not controlled, but familiar. The kind of familiar that makes you adjust your habits without even thinking about it. You wake up, get dressed, and before stepping outside, you mentally review your route. Not for scenery, not for convenience, for survival. Certain streets? Avoid them. Certain neighborhoods? Maybe later, or never. Certain political figures passing through the area? That's your signal to suddenly remember you left something at home. Because movement through Rome now required awareness, not just of where you were going, but of who might also be going there. And with how many friends. Markets, once the centre of daily life, became unpredictable. You could be buying bread one moment, and the next, the entire area could shift from commerce to chaos. Vendors learned to pack quickly, customers learned to leave faster, and everyone developed a shared understanding that if shouting began, you didn't wait for context. You left, immediately. Public gatherings were even worse. Speeches, assemblies, and meetings carried a kind of tension that never fully disappeared. People still attended, of course. Politics mattered, after all. But there was always that quiet awareness in the background. This could go wrong, and often it did. Even simple tasks became complicated. Visiting a friend across the city wasn't just a social decision. It was a logistical one. Which route is safest? What time is least risky? Is there a chance I'll walk directly into something I would strongly prefer not to be part of? Because in Rome, being in the wrong place at the wrong time wasn't bad luck. It was a lifestyle hazard. And yet people adapted. They always do. You learn to read the crowd. You notice shifts in mood, small signs of tension, the way a group suddenly grows quiet or starts moving with purpose. You become faster at reacting, quicker at leaving, better at avoiding eye contact with men who look like they're about to make a point with a stick. It becomes second nature, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. Because once you stop questioning the chaos, once you start accepting it as normal, it stops feeling like something temporary. It becomes part of the system, part of life. And in Rome, life now came with an unspoken rule. Stay alert, stay out of the way, and if things start to escalate, don't ask questions. Just run. So now you have gangs, territory, daily chaos, and naturally, it's time to hold elections. Because nothing says stable democracy like asking people to vote while rival groups are actively trying to remove each other from the general area. In theory, Roman elections were a civic process. Citizens gathered, cast their votes, and helped decide the future of the Republic. In practice, it looked more like an event where attendance came with a risk assessment. Candidates didn't just campaign with speeches and promises. They showed up with support, visible support, very visible support. Groups of loyal men would arrive early, take positions, and make it clear that this was not just a political gathering. It was a controlled environment. Access to voting areas could be blocked, opponents could be intimidated, and if someone insisted on participating in a way that was inconvenient, well, the situation could escalate quickly, because the goal wasn't just to win votes. It was to control who got to vote in the first place. If your supporters couldn't reach the voting area, their opinions became theoretical. If your opponents felt unsafe showing up, their influence quietly disappeared. And if both sides showed up at the same time with equal determination, that's when things got interesting. Crowds would push against each other, tensions rising as each side tried to assert control. Insults turned into shoving. Shoving turned into fights. And fights turned into full-scale disruptions that made the idea of orderly voting feel like a very optimistic suggestion. Officials tried to maintain structure, of course. But maintaining order in that environment was like trying to organize a conversation in the middle of a thunderstorm. Technically possible, realistically unlikely, and here's the part that made it all worse. It worked. Candidates who controlled the streets often controlled the outcome. Not because they had better ideas, but because they had better positioning. Physically, strategically, and sometimes aggressively. So elections stopped being purely about persuasion. They became about access, about presence, about who could stand their ground long enough to make their support count. And for ordinary citizens, this created a difficult choice. Participate and risk becoming part of the chaos, or stay home and let someone else decide the future. Neither option was ideal. But in Rome, ideal situations were becoming increasingly rare, because when politics relies on force, it doesn't just change how decisions are made, it changes who gets to make them. And in a city where showing up required courage, timing, and a bit of luck, democracy started to feel less like a system and more like a gamble. And after years of tension, rivalry, and increasingly enthusiastic disagreements, everything finally came to a head. Not in the Senate, not in the Forum, but on a road, the Appian Way, one of Rome's most important highways, was supposed to be a place of movement, trade, and travel, a connection between the city and the wider world. Instead, on one particular day, it became the setting for a very decisive encounter between Publius Clodius Pulcher and Titus Annius Milo. Both men were travelling, both had their entourages, and neither group was particularly known for de-escalation. Accounts differ on exactly how it started, which is usually a good sign that it escalated immediately. What we do know is that the two groups met on the road, tensions rose, and what followed was less of a conversation and more of a coordinated argument involving weapons. Clodius was wounded early in the clash and taken to a nearby inn. At this point, a calmer story might have ended with both sides retreating, reconsidering their choices, and perhaps reflecting on the importance of conflict resolution. This is not that story. Milo's men, realizing the opportunity in front of them, decided that leaving Clodius alive might lead to future complications. So they returned, dragged him out, and finished what had already begun. Clodius was dead, and just like that, one of Rome's most powerful and chaotic figures was removed from the board. Now, logically, you might expect this to calm things down. One less rival, one less gang leader, one less source of constant disruption. Instead, it did the opposite, because Clodius wasn't just a politician. He had followers, loyal, angry followers, and news of his death didn't spread quietly. It spread quickly, and emotionally. Back in Rome, tension turned into outrage. His supporters gathered, not to discuss the situation calmly, but to react in the only way they knew, with force. The city, already unstable, was about to experience something worse than routine violence. It was about to erupt, because removing a figure like Clodius didn't solve the problem. It exposed it, and when a system built on rivalry suddenly loses one of its central players, the result isn't peace. It's imbalance. And imbalance in a city like Rome doesn't stay quiet for long. It builds, it spreads, and then, very quickly, it explodes. So Clodius is dead, and instead of the city taking a deep breath and calming down, it does the exact opposite, because Clodius wasn't just a politician, he was a symbol, and more importantly, he had a large group of very loyal supporters who were not known for processing grief quietly. When news of his death reached Rome, it didn't arrive gently. It hit like a spark in a room already filled with fuel. Crowds began to gather. Not organized, not controlled, just people, angry, loud, and looking for someone or something to blame. The streets filled quickly, and the mood shifted from tense to explosive in a matter of hours. And when a crowd that size becomes emotional, things tend to escalate fast. Clodius's body was brought back into the city, and what followed was supposed to be a funeral, a moment of mourning, a respectful farewell. Instead, it became something else entirely. The crowd carried his body into the heart of Rome, into the Forum, the political and symbolic centre of the city, and decided that a standard funeral pyre would not be sufficient. No, they wanted something memorable, so they took furniture, then more furniture, and then, in a moment of truly impressive commitment to chaos, they set fire to the Senate House. Yes, the Senate House, a building meant for governance, debate, and the occasional dramatic speech was now being used as part of a funeral bonfire. Flames rose, smoke filled the air, and the centre of Roman political life quite literally went up in smoke, which in hindsight felt a little symbolic. The fire spread, nearby buildings were damaged, and the city descended into full-scale unrest. This wasn't a controlled riot. This was a complete breakdown of order, fueled by anger and the absence of anyone capable of stopping it. Officials tried to respond, but trying to control that crowd was like trying to calm the ocean by asking it nicely. It didn't work, and for a moment, Rome felt less like the capital of a powerful republic, and more like a place where everything had simply slipped out of control. Because this wasn't just about one man's death. It was about what that death represented. Years of tension, rivalry, violence that had been building without restraint. And now, with no release valve, it all came out at once. Loud, destructive, and impossible to ignore. Rome hadn't just lost control of its streets, it had lost control of itself. So after the fires die down, the smoke clears, and the Senate House is no longer structurally optimistic, you might expect Rome to take a moment, to reflect, to say, perhaps we've taken this a bit too far. Rome does not do that. Instead, something far more subtle and far more dangerous happens. People adjust. Because here's the thing about chaos. If it lasts long enough, it stops feeling like chaos. It starts feeling normal. The riots, the street fights, the constant tension. all of it slowly settles into the background of daily life. Not because it's acceptable, but because it's familiar. And humans are remarkably good at adapting to things they probably shouldn't. You still wake up. You still go to work. You still buy bread, avoid eye contact with suspiciously organized groups of men, and continue your day like everything is fine. Because what's the alternative? Constant panic is exhausting. So instead, Rome develops a new rhythm, one where violence isn't an interruption. It's part of the schedule. Public gatherings still happen, but now everyone arrives with an understanding. This could go wrong. Speeches are still given, but they carry an invisible timer. How long before someone decides they've heard enough? Even political disagreement changes. It becomes less about convincing someone and more about outlasting them. Not in argument, but in presence. Who can stay? Who gets pushed out? Who decides that continuing this discussion is no longer worth the risk? And over time, something important shifts. Fear becomes practical. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just calculated. You don't panic when you see a large group gathering. You assess. You adjust your path. You leave early. You learn to recognize patterns. The tone of voices, the movement of crowds, the subtle signals that something is about to escalate. You become efficient at avoiding problems, which sounds like a skill, but it's also a symptom. Because when an entire city learns to navigate around violence instead of preventing it, that violence becomes embedded. It's no longer something external. It's part of the system. And once that happens, reversing it becomes incredibly difficult. Because now, stability isn't the default. Instability is. And stability becomes something you have to actively rebuild. Rome at this point isn't rebuilding anything. It's continuing, moving forward with a system that technically still exists, but no longer fully controls itself, which historically speaking is not a great sign. It's usually what happens right before things start changing, not slowly, but all at once. So now Rome has reached a very uncomfortable stage. Violence is normal, politics is unstable, and the system that's supposed to manage all of this is still there. Technically, but something is off. Because the Roman Republic was built on balance, shared power, traditions, and a very strong belief that no single person should have too much control. It worked for a while, because everyone more or less agreed to follow the rules. Now, the rules are still written. They're just not being followed with any real enthusiasm. Street gangs didn't break the Republic overnight. They didn't storm the Senate and declare the end of the system. What they did was quieter, and in many ways more damaging. They exposed its weaknesses. If laws can't be enforced, they lose meaning. If elections can be controlled through intimidation, they lose legitimacy. And if public spaces aren't safe, then public participation starts to disappear, which is exactly what was happening. People began stepping back, not because they didn't care about politics, but because involvement now came with risk. Showing support, attending gatherings, even being seen in the wrong place could put you in a situation you had no interest in being part of. And when participation drops, the system starts to tilt, because power doesn't disappear. It concentrates into fewer hands, stronger hands backed not just by influence but by force. At the same time, Rome was dealing with bigger pressures, expanding territory, growing armies, and generals who were becoming very popular with their troops. Loyalty was shifting, slowly but noticeably, away from the Republic and toward individuals. And unlike street gangs, these individuals didn't just have followers, they had armies, disciplined, trained, and significantly more effective than a group of men with sticks. So while the streets remained chaotic, something else was happening in the background, a shift from local, scattered violence to centralized power. Because when a system can't maintain order on its own, people start looking for someone who can, even if that means giving up the very system they were trying to protect. And that's the quiet turning point, not when the Republic falls, but when people stop believing it can hold. Because once that belief is gone, the structure is still standing, but the foundation is already cracked. And in Rome, those cracks were spreading, slowly, silently, until the moment they wouldn't be silent anymore. And this is where everything finally comes together. Not neatly, not cleanly, but inevitably, because the violence of Rome's streets, the gangs, the rivalries, the constant instability, didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a larger shift, one that had been building quietly, while everyone was busy avoiding bricks and making strategic exits. The Republic was weakening, not in a dramatic single moment, but in a slow unraveling. Trust in the system was fading. Laws were being bent, ignored, or enforced selectively, and power was no longer something shared carefully among institutions. It was being gathered, concentrated, held by individuals who could command loyalty, not just through influence but through force. Street gangs had already shown how effective that could be on a smaller scale. Control the streets, control the outcome. Intimidate your rivals and suddenly the rules become flexible. Now imagine that same principle, but with armies, because as Rome expanded, its generals became more powerful. They led campaigns, won victories, and gained the loyalty of their soldiers. Loyalty that didn't always transfer back to the Republic. These weren't just commanders, they were figures people followed, trusted, feared. And once that kind of power enters politics, the balance begins to disappear entirely. The chaos of the streets had already normalized the idea that force could shape outcomes. That intimidation could replace persuasion, that if you had enough men behind you, you didn't need to wait for approval. You could act, so when larger conflicts began, when rival leaders turned their attention from the streets to the entire Republic, the transition felt less shocking than it should have, because Rome had already practiced this, just on a smaller scale. The gangs didn't destroy the Republic on their own, but they helped create the environment where its collapse became possible. They blurred the line between politics and violence, between authority and intimidation, until that line eventually disappeared altogether. And when it did, something new took its place. Not shared power, not balanced governance, but centralized control. The empire, a system where order would return, but at a cost. Stability would be restored, but freedom would be redefined. And the chaos of the streets would be replaced by something far more controlled and far more absolute. Because in the end, Rome didn't just lose control, it handed it over, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold on to, and all that remained was a single truth. When violence becomes the language of power, power eventually speaks with one voice. The story of Anne Boleyn does not begin with her execution, nor with the crown placed upon her head, but with the quiet, persistent whispers that followed her long before she ever became queen. Before she entered the dangerous orbit of Henry VIII, Anne had already become something unusual. Raised in part at the refined courts of France, she returned to England not as a passive noblewoman, but as someone shaped by elegance, intelligence, and, perhaps most dangerously, self-awareness. She knew her value, and she knew how to use it. At court, where women were often expected to be charming but silent, beautiful but replaceable, Anne refused to blend into the background. She was witty, sharp, and at times openly defiant. She laughed differently. She spoke differently. She carried herself not like someone waiting to be chosen, but like someone deciding for herself. And that alone was enough to make people uneasy. Because in a place like the Tudor court, difference was rarely admired. It was examined, questioned, and eventually turned into suspicion. The whispers began subtly. Some claimed she was too proud. Others suggested she was overly flirtatious, though no one could quite prove it. And then, slowly, the tone shifted. These were no longer harmless court gossip murmurs, but seeds of something darker. Rumours about her relationships, her intentions, and her supposed ability to manipulate the men around her. It didn't help that Anne had already been linked, however loosely, to powerful figures. Her earlier connection to Henry Percy raised eyebrows, especially when the relationship was abruptly ended under pressure. Why had it ended so suddenly? Who had intervened? And more importantly, what had already happened between them? No one knew for certain, but certainty was never required for suspicion to grow. By the time Anne caught the attention of the king himself, the court was already watching her, not with admiration, but with curiosity mixed with quiet hostility. She was no longer just a woman navigating court life. She had become a question mark. And in Tudor England, being a question mark was often the first step toward becoming a target. If Anne Boleyn had remained just another clever woman at court, history might have forgotten her. But everything changed the moment she caught the attention of Henry VIII, a man who was not used to hearing the word no. At the time, the king was already married to Catherine of Aragon, a queen who had given him stability, loyalty, and years of companionship. But not the one thing he wanted most: a male heir. The court knew it, the kingdom knew it, and Henry himself felt it like a constant gnawing pressure. So when Anne entered his world, she wasn't just another distraction. She became something far more dangerous, a possibility. But Anne did something unexpected. She refused him, not dramatically, not loudly, but firmly enough to make him chase her. Where other women had accepted the king's attention as a blessing or a survival strategy, Anne turned it into a game of distance. She would not be his mistress. If he wanted her, she made it clear it would have to be on very different terms, and for a king like Henry, that was irresistible. His fascination quickly turned into obsession. Letters began to flow, passionate, almost desperate in tone. He called her his mistress and friend, wrote of longing, of sleepless nights, of a desire that seemed to grow stronger the more she remained just out of reach. But this wasn't just romance. It was politics, power and risk tangled together, because the more Henry wanted Anne, the more impossible his current marriage became. What began as private desire soon turned into a public crisis. The king started searching for a way out, questioning the legitimacy of his marriage, pushing for an annulment, even challenging the authority of the church itself. All for Anne. At court, people began to notice. Some were intrigued, others were alarmed, and many were quietly hostile. Because Anne wasn't just capturing the king's attention, she was reshaping the kingdom around her. And that raised an uncomfortable question that lingered in every whispered conversation. Was she simply the object of Henry's obsession, or was she in some way controlling it? As the king's obsession deepened, what had once been a private fascination turned into something far more volatile. Anne Boleyn was no longer just resisting Henry VIII. She was now at the centre of a storm that threatened to upend an entire kingdom. Because Henry was not a man who simply desired, he acted. His determination to be with Anne began to reshape England itself. The push to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon dragged on for years, entangling politics, religion, and power in a slow-burning crisis. What should have been a private marital dispute became a public spectacle, watched closely by nobles, clergy, and foreign powers alike. And through it all, Anne waited. But waiting did not mean passivity. Anne's position was delicate, dangerously so. If she gave in too soon, she risked becoming just another discarded mistress. If she refused for too long, she risked losing the king's favour entirely. Every glance, every word, every interaction had to be calculated. She had to remain desirable, but unattainable, loyal, but never fully possessed. And this balancing act only fueled the rumours surrounding her. At court, people began to whisper that no woman could hold the king at such distance without some deeper influence. Some claimed she bewitched him, not literally perhaps, but through charm, intelligence, and a kind of emotional control that Henry had never experienced before. Others insisted something more physical must have already happened between them, something hidden behind closed doors, something that explained his relentless devotion. There was no proof, but proof was never necessary. The longer the situation dragged on, the more tension built, not just between Henry and the church, but within the court itself. Factions began to form. Some supported Anne, seeing her rise as an opportunity. Others despised her, viewing her as a dangerous disruptor who threatened the old order. And Anne herself? She was no longer simply navigating court life. She was navigating expectations that grew heavier with each passing day. The king had risked everything for her. His marriage, his reputation, even his relationship with Rome, which meant one thing was now unavoidable. Anne had to deliver. Not just affection, not just loyalty, but something far more important, an heir. When Anne Boleyn finally became queen, it should have been the end of the struggle. Years of tension, resistance, and political upheaval had led to this moment. Henry VIII had broken from Rome, reshaped the church in England, and cast aside his first marriage, all to place the crown upon Anne's head. And yet, strangely, the whispers did not stop. They grew louder, because now Anne was no longer just a woman surrounded by rumours. She was a queen surrounded by expectations, and more importantly, she was a queen many people did not accept. Her coronation in 1533 was grand, carefully staged to display legitimacy and power. But beneath the gold, the silk, and the spectacle, there was tension in the air. The people watched her, not with pure admiration, but with curiosity, suspicion, and in some cases, quiet resentment. To many, she was not a rightful queen. She was the woman who had replaced Catherine of Aragon, the woman who had disrupted the natural order, the woman whose relationship with the king had already been questioned long before her coronation day. And now those questions returned, sharper than before. Because if Anne had once been accused of manipulating the king to rise, what would she do now that she had reached the top? Every move she made was observed. Every smile, every conversation, every glance exchanged at court became material for speculation. Her confidence, once intriguing, was now seen as arrogance. Her intelligence, once admired, was now viewed as dangerous. And then came the moment that should have secured everything. The birth of her child. In September 1533, Anne gave birth, not to a son, as everyone had hoped, but to a daughter, Elizabeth I. Outwardly, celebration still took place, but beneath the surface, disappointment spread quickly. The promise Anne had carried, the one that justified everything Henry had done, suddenly felt uncertain, and with that uncertainty came a shift. The same court that had once feared her rise now began to quietly question her future. The same whispers that had followed her before her marriage returned with new intensity, this time not just about her past relationships, but about her worth as a queen. Because Anne's position had never truly been secure, and now, for the first time since she wore the crown, it began to look fragile. By the time Anne Boleyn realised how fragile her position had become, the whispers that once surrounded her had already begun to change shape. They were no longer just idle gossip drifting through corridors and behind closed doors. They were becoming weapons. At the court of Henry VIII, power was never stable. It shifted constantly like sand underfoot, and those who had once tolerated Anne's rise were now beginning to see an opportunity in her potential fall. Because Anne had failed to deliver the one thing that justified everything, the son Henry had risked his kingdom for. And in that failure, her enemies found their opening. It started quietly. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room, glances exchanged between courtiers, smiles that lingered just a little too long as if they knew something she did not. Then came the stories. Subtle at first, almost harmless. That she was too familiar with certain men, that she laughed too freely, that she behaved in ways a queen should not. None of it was proven. None of it needed to be. Because the idea itself was enough. Men like Thomas Cromwell began to watch more closely. Cromwell, a master of survival in a court built on betrayal, understood something Anne perhaps underestimated. Once a narrative begins to form, it can be shaped, guided, and eventually controlled. And the narrative forming around Anne was dangerous. Names began to surface. Men she had spoken to, laughed with, or simply been seen near. Among them was Mark Smeaton, a court musician of relatively low status. The very idea that a queen could be linked to someone like him was scandalous enough to spread quickly. Then there were others, noblemen, courtiers, men who had always been part of her world. Each connection, no matter how innocent, was twisted into something suggestive. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rumours began to shift from possibility to assumption. Because once people start to believe something might be true, it doesn't take long before they act as if it already is. Anne, who had once mastered the art of controlling attention, now found herself trapped by it. Every interaction could be misinterpreted. Every word could be used against her. And the most dangerous part? She no longer controlled the story. Others did. And they were beginning to write an ending that did not include her survival. By the time the rumours surrounding Anne Boleyn reached their peak, something had already shifted behind the scenes. What had once been whispers and speculation was now being organised, carefully, deliberately, into something far more dangerous. Accusations. At the centre of it all stood Thomas Cromwell, a man who understood that in a court like this, survival depended not on truth, but on control. And control came from narrative. Cromwell began gathering names. Not evidence, names. Men who had spoken with Anne. Men who had been seen near her. Men who, under the right pressure, could become part of a story convincing enough to destroy a queen. Among the first was Mark Smeaton. Unlike the others, Smeaton had no noble protection, no powerful family to shield him. He was vulnerable, and in a situation like this, vulnerability was everything. He was arrested, questioned, pressured, and eventually he confessed. What exactly he confessed to, and under what circumstances, remains one of the most debated aspects of Anne's story. But in that moment, the details mattered less than the result. A confession had been obtained, and with it, the rumours began to solidify into something that looked dangerously like proof. From there, the accusation spread. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton. Each name added weight to the growing case. Each accusation reinforced the idea that Anne had not simply been careless, but actively disloyal. And then came the most shocking charge of all. George Boleyn, her own brother, was accused of being involved with her. It was an accusation so extreme, so scandalous, that it pushed the entire narrative beyond mere infidelity into something almost unthinkable. But that was precisely the point. Because once a story reaches that level of shock, it stops being questioned. It becomes something people react to emotionally, rather than logically. And in that emotional reaction, doubt fades. Anne, who had once been surrounded by whispers she could navigate, now faced a fully formed set of charges that seemed overwhelming in their scale. It was no longer about one rumour or one relationship. It was about a pattern that painted her not as a queen under pressure, but as a woman who had betrayed her king, her marriage, and even the boundaries of family itself. And once that image was accepted, even by a few, the outcome began to feel inevitable. Once the charges against Anne Boleyn had been assembled, the next step was almost inevitable. She would stand trial, but from the very beginning, it was clear this would not be a trial in the way we understand justice today. This was a performance, one carefully arranged to confirm what had already been decided behind closed doors. Anne was arrested in May 1536 and taken to the Tower of London, a place that had seen many powerful figures enter, and very few leave freely. For a woman who had once walked through royal palaces as queen, the transition was brutal. The same court that had once admired or feared her now watched from a distance, silent and unmoving. Inside the tower, Anne's behaviour was described as shifting between composure and distress. At times she laughed, at times she seemed overwhelmed, speaking rapidly, almost as if trying to outrun the reality closing in around her. Meanwhile, the men accused alongside her were being tried and condemned one by one. Their fates were sealed quickly, efficiently, each verdict reinforcing the image that had been constructed around Anne. By the time her own trial began, the atmosphere was already heavy with expectation. She was brought before a panel of nobles, among them men who had once known her well, men who had dined with her, spoken with her, perhaps even admired her rise. Now they sat in judgment. Anne defended herself with intelligence and clarity. She denied the accusations, challenged the logic behind them, and pointed out the inconsistencies. By many accounts, she spoke with remarkable composure, especially given the severity of the charges. But logic was no longer the deciding factor, because the case against her was not built to be dismantled, it was built to be believed. The accusations of adultery, of betrayal, of forbidden relationships had already taken root in the minds of those watching, and once such an image is accepted, it becomes incredibly difficult to erase. One by one the charges were read. One by one they were affirmed. And then came the verdict. Guilty. The sentence was death. In that moment the transformation was complete. Anne Boleyn was no longer a queen, no longer a figure of fascination or controversy. She had been reduced to something far simpler in the eyes of the court, a problem that had now been solved. And yet, even as the trial ended and the outcome seemed final, one question lingered quietly beneath the surface. Not whether she had been found guilty, but whether she had ever truly been given a chance to be innocent. After the verdict was delivered, there was no dramatic pause, no last-minute reversal, no sudden realization of doubt. The machinery of the court moved forward with quiet efficiency, as if everything had already been decided long before Anne Boleyn ever stepped into the courtroom. Back inside the Tower of London, Anne now faced a reality that could no longer be avoided. The title of Queen had been stripped away, her influence erased almost overnight. What remained was time, very little of it, and the weight of knowing how quickly everything had unravelled. Accounts from her final days describe a woman who, despite everything, regained a kind of calm. Not the confidence she once carried at court, but something quieter, something more reflective. She spoke with those around her, prayed, and at times even showed a strange, almost unsettling composure. Outside the tower, preparations were already underway. The execution was to be carried out not with a traditional axe, but with a sword, brought specially from France. It was a detail that stood out, almost symbolic. Even in death, Anne's story remained tied to the place that had once shaped her. Meanwhile, Henry VIII remained distant. There were no recorded attempts to intervene, no visible hesitation. The same king who had once rewritten the course of a kingdom to be with her now allowed the process to continue without interruption. And that silence said more than any words could have. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold within the Tower grounds. A small crowd gathered, carefully controlled, carefully chosen. This was not meant to be a spectacle, but it was still a moment that would echo far beyond those walls. She addressed those present briefly, avoiding direct accusation, speaking instead with measured dignity. Whether out of caution, acceptance, or something else entirely, she did not openly challenge the king or the charges against her. Then in a matter of seconds it was over. The rise that had once reshaped England ended quietly. And just like that, Anne Boleyn became something else entirely. Not a queen, not a rival, not even a scandal. A memory. But as the court moved on, swiftly, almost eagerly, the questions she left behind did not disappear, because while her story had reached its end, the mystery of how it truly unfolded had only just begun. With the death of Anne Boleyn, the court of Henry VIII moved on with almost unsettling speed. Within days, attention shifted, alliances adjusted, and a new queen would soon take her place. On the surface, it was as if Anne had simply been removed from the story. But beneath that surface, something lingered, because the charges that had destroyed her, adultery, betrayal, even the most extreme accusations, were never fully settled in the minds of those who came after. The speed of the proceedings, the reliance on confessions obtained under pressure, and the sheer scale of the accusations raised doubts almost immediately. And over time, those doubts only grew stronger. Historians have long questioned the case built against Anne. The timeline of the alleged relationships often overlaps in ways that seem physically impossible. Some accusations place her in locations where records suggest she could not have been. Others rely heavily on the confession of Mark Smeaton, a confession many believe was forced. Then there is the role of Thomas Cromwell, whose political interests may have aligned perfectly with Anne's removal. Was he simply carrying out the king's will, or shaping it? And what of the king himself? Henry's transformation is perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire story. The man who once pursued Anne relentlessly, who altered the course of a nation to be with her, ultimately allowed her destruction without visible resistance. Whether driven by disappointment, political necessity, or something more personal, his silence remains one of the most debated aspects of her fall. But perhaps the most important question is the simplest one. Was Anne guilty? The truth is, no definitive answer exists. What survives are fragments, letters, testimonies, records shaped by those who had something to gain or something to protect. Each piece tells part of the story, but none tell it completely. And so, Anne Boleyn remains suspended between two versions of history. In one, she is a calculating figure who rose too quickly and fell because of her own actions. In the other, she is a victim of a court that turned against her, a woman undone by politics, expectations, and the dangerous power of rumour. Perhaps the real answer lies somewhere in between, or perhaps it was lost the moment whispers became weapons, and truth became whatever the court needed it to be. Saloon girls weren't just entertainers, they were something far more subtle, and far more powerful than most people in the room realised. Step into a crowded saloon in the American West, somewhere like Deadwood or Dodge City. The doors swing open, boots drag dust across the floor, and the air hums with noise. Cards slapping against tables, glasses clinking, voices rising just a little too loud. It looks chaotic. It feels unpredictable, but it isn't as uncontrolled as it seems. Because in the middle of all that noise, there are women moving carefully through the room, watching everything. Saloon girls. On the surface, their role appears simple. They laugh at jokes, pour drinks, sit beside customers, and keep the money flowing. They are expected to be charming, attentive, and just mysterious enough to keep men coming back for more. To most customers, they are part of the entertainment, no different from the music or the gambling tables. But that's exactly why they were so effective, because while everyone was focused on being seen, these women focused on seeing. They noticed who arrived first and who followed, who drank too much and who stayed sober, who spoke openly and who whispered. In a place where deals were made quickly, and trust was often an illusion, information became the most valuable currency in the room, and saloon girls were surrounded by it. A careless comment here, a drunken confession there, a frustrated gambler revealing more than he intended. Men spoke freely around them, often assuming they weren't really listening, or worse, assuming they didn't matter. That assumption was their greatest advantage, because the less threatening they appeared, the more invisible they became. And the more invisible they became, the more they could influence what happened around them. Some passed information quietly to saloon owners. Others shared it with gamblers, lawmen, or powerful figures moving through the frontier. A well-placed word, a subtle warning, or even a carefully timed smile could shift the direction of a deal, a rivalry, or a reputation. And most of the men never even noticed, because in a world that underestimated them, saloon girls learned something very quickly. Power didn't always sit at the poker table. Sometimes it walked quietly between it. Because in places like Deadwood and Dodge City, information wasn't just useful. It could be the difference between profit and ruin, or even life and death. And saloon girls were perfectly positioned to collect it. Men came into saloons carrying more than coins. They carried frustration, ambition, secrets, and sometimes a little too much alcohol. And alcohol, as it turns out, has a remarkable ability to loosen both the tongue and the judgment. A cattle deal discussed too loudly. A poker strategy revealed in irritation. A grudge admitted after one drink too many. To most people, these were forgettable moments. To a saloon girl, they were pieces of a much larger puzzle, because listening in that environment was not passive, it was deliberate. A good saloon girl didn't just hear words, she understood tone, timing, and intention. She knew when a man was bluffing, when he was desperate, and when he was dangerous. She could tell the difference between a story meant to impress and a truth that slipped out by accident. And once she understood those differences, she had something valuable. Control. Information could be passed quietly to the right person. A saloon owner looking to protect his business, a gambler trying to gain an edge, or even a lawman trying to stay one step ahead of trouble. In some cases, it could be used more directly. A subtle hint dropped into the right conversation could change how someone was perceived, who they trusted, or what decision they made next. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough. And that's what made it effective. Because influence in a saloon didn't come from shouting the loudest or holding the most money. It came from shaping what others believed was true. Of course, this kind of power came with risk. Knowing too much could make you valuable, but it could also make you dangerous. And in a place where reputations were fragile and tempers were quick, being seen as someone who held secrets was not always a safe position to be in. So saloon girls learned another skill. They didn't just listen. They knew when to stay silent. If listening gave saloon girls access to information, then what they did next gave them something even more powerful: control over reputation. And in frontier towns like Deadwood or Dodge City, reputation was everything. It could protect you, ruin you, or get you killed faster than a bad hand at the poker table. Because out here, most people didn't know each other's past, which meant your reputation wasn't built on truth. It was built on what people believed, and that belief could be shaped. Saloon girls understood this better than almost anyone. They were constantly moving between groups: gamblers, cowboys, lawmen, businessmen, carrying small pieces of information from one table to another, not in obvious ways, never in a way that made it look intentional, just enough to influence how someone was seen. A compliment repeated at the right moment could turn a stranger into someone respected. A quiet doubt introduced into conversation could make others question a man's honesty. A rumour, softened and disguised as concern, could spread through the room without ever appearing to have a source. And once it started, it rarely needed help. Because men in those rooms were already competing. For money, for status, for control. All a saloon girl had to do was tilt the balance slightly. The rest would take care of itself. Sometimes it was subtle. A gambler gains a reputation for being lucky. People play him differently. A newcomer is described as unreliable. Doors begin to close. A man is hinted to be dangerous. Others treat him with caution, even if they're not sure why. And none of it needed to be proven. Because in a place built on perception, belief was enough. Of course, this wasn't always done out of malice. Sometimes it was about survival. Sometimes it was about loyalty. to a saloon owner, a friend, or even to themselves. But regardless of the reason, the effect was the same. Saloon girls didn't just observe the social structure of the room, they quietly reshaped it. And the most fascinating part, the men whose reputations were being built, or destroyed, often believed they were in control of their own image. They thought their actions defined them. But in reality, their story was being written elsewhere, in quiet conversations, soft laughter, and carefully chosen words drifting through the saloon air. If shaping reputations gave saloon girls influence over the room, proximity gave them influence over individuals, and sometimes the most powerful ones. Because in places like Deadwood and Dodge City, power didn't sit in offices or formal halls. It sat at tables, behind whiskey glasses, and across late-night conversations where decisions were made informally, quickly, and often under the influence. And saloon girls were always close to those conversations, closer than anyone else. They sat beside men others couldn't easily approach. They poured drinks, laughed at jokes, and stayed just long enough to become familiar, without ever seeming intrusive. This closeness created something rare in that environment. Access. A lawman might keep his distance from most people, but not from a woman who made the long night feel easier. A businessman might guard his plans carefully, but loosen his caution after hours of conversation and drink. Even the most guarded men needed someone to talk to. Someone who wasn't a rival, a threat, or a competitor. And that's exactly what saloon girls appeared to be. Not a threat, which made them uniquely positioned to influence decisions in ways that felt almost invisible. A suggestion framed as casual conversation. A question that made someone reconsider their next move. A reaction, approval, doubt, or concern that subtly shaped how a man felt about his own choices. It didn't take much, because decisions made in those rooms were often fragile. A deal could collapse over suspicion. A partnership could form over trust that had no real foundation. And in those moments, even the smallest influence could tip the outcome. Some saloon girls used this carefully, building connections that extended far beyond the bar room. Others became trusted confidants, people whose opinions, though never official, carried surprising weight. And then there were those who understood something even deeper. Influence didn't always mean control in the obvious sense. It didn't require commands or authority. Sometimes it was simply about being present at the right moment, saying the right thing, or even choosing to say nothing at all. Because when someone trusts you enough to listen, you don't need to force anything, you just need to guide it. And in a world where power was constantly shifting, that kind of quiet guidance could shape outcomes far more effectively than force ever could. By now it might seem like saloon girls held all the power. They listened, they observed, they influenced, and often without anyone realizing it. But the reality was far more complicated, because the power they held was never fully their own. In towns like Deadwood and Dodge City, saloons were businesses first, and everything inside them, every drink, every game, every conversation, was tied to profit. And at the centre of that system stood the saloon owners, men who understood exactly how valuable these women were. Saloon girls were not just employees, they were assets. They kept customers spending, kept tensions manageable, and in many cases helped maintain the flow of information that allowed a saloon to stay one step ahead of trouble. And because of that, their freedom was often limited. They were expected to behave a certain way, to prioritise certain customers, to keep the atmosphere lively but controlled. If they gained influence, it was tolerated, sometimes even encouraged, but only as long as it served the interests of the establishment. The moment it didn't, things could change quickly, because while a saloon girl might influence a gambler or a businessman, she could not easily influence the system she was part of. Her position depended on staying useful, on maintaining favour, and on navigating a world where power was always held by someone else. And that created a strange balance. On one hand, she could shape conversations, guide decisions, and affect reputations. On the other, she had to be careful not to overstep, not to draw too much attention, not to become a problem herself. It was influence without security, power without protection. Some managed this balance skillfully, building connections that gave them a degree of independence. Others found themselves trapped, valued for what they could do, but easily replaced if they became inconvenient. And this is where the illusion begins to crack, because from the outside, it might look like they controlled the room, but in reality, they were part of a much larger structure, one that allowed them to influence others, while still controlling them in return. And perhaps the most dangerous part of that structure was this: the same men who trusted them, confided in them, and listened to them, were often the very ones who ultimately held their fate in their hands. By this point, it's clear that saloon girls could shape conversations, influence decisions, and even affect reputations. But in a place like Deadwood or Dodge City, influence didn't just bring opportunity, it brought risk. Because the moment someone realizes you might have power over them, you become a problem. At first, everything feels manageable. Conversations flow, information is exchanged subtly, and influence remains quiet, almost invisible. But over time, patterns begin to form. The same gambler keeps winning, the same businessman always seems one step ahead, the same conflicts somehow get resolved before they explode. And eventually, someone starts asking questions. Where is this coming from? And more importantly, who is behind it? Saloon girls had to live in that tension constantly. Knowing things was useful until it became noticeable. Being trusted was valuable until that trust turned into suspicion. Because once a man believed that his words might be used against him, the dynamic changed instantly. And not always in a calm or reasonable way. This was the frontier. Reactions were fast. Tempers were faster. A careless accusation could lead to confrontation. A rumour about betrayal could escalate into violence. And in a room filled with men already on edge, drinking, gambling, competing, it didn't take much to turn suspicion into something far more serious. Which meant saloon girls had to master yet another skill: damage control. They learned when to diffuse tension, when to redirect attention, and when to disappear from a situation entirely. Sometimes that meant smoothing over misunderstandings with charm. Other times, it meant denying knowledge, even when they knew exactly what was going on, because survival depended on it. There were moments when influence had to be abandoned completely, when the safest move was to step back, stay quiet, and let events unfold without interference. And those moments revealed something important. Influence was not about constant control. It was about knowing when not to use it, because in a world where information could shift power, it could also attract danger just as quickly. And for the women navigating that world, the line between being valuable and being vulnerable was incredibly thin. Cross it, and no amount of charm or intelligence could guarantee you'd make it back safely. If influence inside the saloon was subtle, what happened behind the scenes was even more complex. Because by this stage, it wasn't just about conversations and quiet manipulation, it was about alliances. And alliances in places like Deadwood and Dodge City could decide everything. Saloon girls rarely operated alone. Over time, many formed quiet understandings with bartenders, dealers, bouncers, and even other women working the floor. These weren't formal agreements. No contracts, no promises written down. Just shared interests and mutual awareness, a nod across the room. A look that meant watch him, a subtle shift in behaviour when someone important walked in. These small signals created networks, loose, flexible, but incredibly effective. Because while one person might notice something, a group could understand it. Information moved quietly through these networks. A gambler suspected of cheating, a newcomer with more money than sense, a lawman asking too many questions. None of it needed to be announced openly. It was passed along in fragments pieced together in real time, and once that information was shared, the entire room could adapt without anyone outside the circle realizing it. But alliances didn't stop at the saloon doors. Some saloon girls developed connections with powerful figures moving through the frontier: businessmen, gamblers, lawmen, and occasionally men whose influence didn't come from any official position at all. These relationships could offer protection, opportunity, or leverage, depending on how they were managed. And managing them was everything, because alliances were not always stable. They shifted, just like everything else in that environment. A trusted contact one week could become a liability the next. A favour granted could turn into an expectation, and loyalty, while valuable, was rarely unconditional. So saloon girls learned to navigate these relationships carefully. They gave just enough to maintain trust. They held back just enough to protect themselves. And most importantly, they avoided becoming dependent on any single alliance. Because dependence meant vulnerability. And vulnerability in that world was dangerous. What makes this even more fascinating is how invisible these alliances often were. To the average person walking into the saloon, everything looked spontaneous. Random conversations, casual interactions, chance encounters. But underneath that surface, connections were constantly forming, shifting and dissolving. And at the centre of many of those connections were the women most people underestimated. For a time, it could almost feel like saloon girls had mastered the system, reading people, shaping outcomes, building alliances that gave them a quiet edge in a chaotic world. But the deeper they moved into that world, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. The game could always turn against them. In frontier towns like Deadwood and Dodge City, stability was an illusion. Fortunes changed overnight. Power shifted without warning. And when that shift happened, the same connections that once offered protection could quickly become liabilities. A man who trusted you yesterday might suspect you today. A powerful ally might lose his position or his life. A rumour you helped shape might circle back, with your name attached to it. And in those moments, influence stopped being an advantage. It became exposure, because the more connected you were, the more people knew your face, your habits, your role in the room. And once attention turned toward you, the invisibility that once protected you began to disappear. Some saloon girls found themselves caught in conflicts they never intended to be part of. A deal gone wrong. A rivalry escalating. A piece of information shared at the wrong time. Suddenly, they were no longer observers. They were involved. And involvement carried consequences. There were stories, quiet ones, often left out of official records, of women who had to leave town quickly, disappearing before tensions could reach them. Others were forced to choose sides in disputes that had nothing to do with them, simply because they were connected to the wrong person at the wrong time. And then there were those who stayed and paid the price, because in a world where reputation and suspicion could turn violent without warning, being seen as someone who influenced outcomes could make you a target. Not always openly, not always immediately, but gradually, as trust eroded and questions grew sharper. What makes this stage of the story so important is how it reframes everything that came before. The listening, the influence, the alliances, it all worked. Until it didn't. Because power in that environment was never permanent. It was borrowed, negotiated, and constantly at risk of being taken away. And once it started to slip, there was very little anyone could do to stop it. By the time we reach the end of this story, one thing should be clear. Saloon girls were never just background figures in the Wild West. In places like Deadwood and Dodge City, they stood at the centre of a world that appeared chaotic, but was quietly shaped by conversation, perception, and influence. They listened when others talked too much. They noticed when others were distracted. They understood people in ways that many never realised. And through those skills, they gained something rare in that environment. Access to the invisible currents that moved everything forward. But what makes their story so compelling isn't just the influence they held, it's the way they held it. Not through titles, not through official authority, but through presence, awareness and timing. They didn't need to sit at the poker table to shape the outcome of a game. They didn't need to lead a negotiation to influence a deal. Often, all it took was a well-placed word, a moment of silence, or a reaction that nudged someone in a different direction. And yet, despite all of this, their role was rarely recognised in the moment, because the men around them believed they were in control. They believed their decisions were their own, their reputations, their alliances, their victories, all self-made. But as we've seen, that wasn't always the full story. Behind many of those outcomes were subtle influences, quiet observations, and carefully timed interactions that shaped the path forward. Still, this influence came at a cost. It was unstable, it was risky, and it was rarely acknowledged. The same world that allowed saloon girls to gather information and shape outcomes also limited their security and exposed them to sudden shifts in power. Their influence existed in a fragile space, real but never guaranteed. And maybe that's what makes their story linger, because it challenges the way we think about power. We often imagine power as something visible, titles, wealth, authority. But the world of the saloon reveals a different kind of power, one that moves quietly, operates in the background, and shapes events without ever taking credit. Saloon girls lived in that space. Not fully in control, but never powerless, and long after the music faded and the saloon doors closed, their influence remained, woven into the outcomes, decisions and stories that defined the frontier itself. Long before gold, crowns, or royal treasure, humans were already decorating themselves, not for wealth, not for status, but for something far more instinctive. In prehistoric landscapes, long before cities or written language, early humans began to notice the small details of the world around them. A smooth shell shaped by the sea, a sharp animal tooth left behind after a hunt, a piece of bone that caught the light in a certain way. These objects were not just collected, they were chosen. And once chosen, they were transformed. At sites like Blombos Cave, archaeologists have uncovered tiny shell beads, each carefully pierced, likely strung together and worn close to the body. Think about what that means. No metal tools, no advanced technology, just time, effort, and a clear purpose behind the act. Because this wasn't about survival. No one needed beads to hunt. No one needed ornaments to stay warm. This was something else entirely. These early adornments suggest that humans were already thinking beyond the physical world. They were beginning to understand identity, how they appeared, how they were seen, and perhaps even how they wished to be remembered. A necklace of shells might signal belonging to a group. A tooth worn around the neck might represent strength, skill, or survival. And once that idea took hold, it changed everything. Because jewellery in its earliest form was not just decoration, it was communication. Without words, these objects told stories. They showed who you were, where you came from, what you had done. In a world without written language, the body itself became a canvas, and jewellery became one of the first ways humans used it. There is also something deeper here. Many of these objects were not easy to obtain. Some shells came from distant shores. Some materials required effort, travel, or trade. That means these early pieces were not just personal, they were meaningful. They carried value, not because of money, but because of what it took to acquire them. And perhaps most importantly, they were intentional. Someone, thousands of years ago, looked at a simple object and decided it mattered enough to carry, to shape, and to wear. That decision marks a quiet but powerful shift in human history. Because the moment we began to decorate ourselves, we began to define ourselves. If the first pieces of jewellery were born from instinct, the next stage came from understanding. Because over time, early humans didn't just collect objects from nature, they began to assign meaning to them. And that changed everything. What started as simple adornment, shells, bones, stones, slowly became something more deliberate. A tooth was no longer just a tooth. A bead was no longer just decoration. Each piece began to carry a story, a memory, or a belief. In sites across the ancient world, from Blombos Cave to early settlements in Mesopotamia, archaeologists have found objects that suggest this shift. Materials were chosen not only for their appearance, but for what they represented. A hunter might wear the tooth of an animal not just as decoration, but as a symbol of strength or survival. A shell from a distant shore might represent travel, connection, or even identity within a group. And once meaning enters the picture, jewellery stops being just something you wear. It becomes something you are. This is where the concept of the amulet begins to emerge. Objects believed to hold protective or spiritual power, not because of what they were made of, but because of what people believed they could do. A carved stone might be worn to ward off danger. A specific bead might be tied to luck, fertility, or protection. Whether those beliefs were true didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed them. And belief has always been one of the strongest forces shaping human behaviour. As communities grew and interactions became more complex, jewellery also began to reflect relationships. A piece might indicate belonging to a group, a family, or a shared belief system. It could signal trust, alliance, or even status within a small community. Suddenly, what you wore told others something about you, before you even spoke. And this created a new layer of importance, because once objects carry meaning, they also carry value. Not necessarily in wealth, but in significance. Losing a piece of jewellery was no longer just losing an object. It could mean losing protection, identity, or connection. And from that point on, jewellery was no longer just part of human life. It was woven into it. Once jewellery began to carry meaning, it was only a matter of time before humans tried to control how it was made. And that's where things changed again. Because early adornments were once shaped by nature, found, collected, slightly altered. But now people wanted more than what nature offered. They wanted precision. They wanted intention. They wanted to create. In early civilizations like Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, this shift becomes visible. Jewellery was no longer just assembled from natural objects. It was crafted. Materials were cut, polished, drilled, and shaped with increasing skill. Beads became more uniform. Designs became more complex. Patterns began to appear, not random but planned, and with that, a new role emerged in society, the artisan. These were individuals who specialized in creating objects that others could not easily replicate. They understood materials, tools, and techniques. They knew how to shape stone without breaking it, how to drill through hard surfaces, how to combine different elements into something cohesive. And as their skill grew, so did their importance. Because now, jewellery wasn't just something you could find or make yourself. It became something you needed someone else to create. And that introduced something new into the equation: value. A simple shell might still hold meaning, but a carefully crafted piece, one that required time, skill, and knowledge, carried a different kind of weight. It was no longer just about what the object represented. It was also about the effort behind it. And effort, in any society, becomes a form of currency. This is also where materials began to change. While bone and shell were still used, new resources started to appear. Stones chosen for colour, early forms of metal, and materials that were harder to obtain. The more difficult something was to acquire or shape, the more valuable it became. And slowly, almost quietly, jewellery began to move towards something new. Not just identity, not just belief, but status. Because once some pieces are harder to make than others, not everyone can have them. And that difference between what is common and what is rare is where power begins to enter the story. Once craftsmanship introduced value, it didn't take long for something else to emerge: control. Because in growing civilizations like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, resources were no longer evenly available. Gold, rare stones, and skilled artisans were concentrated in the hands of the elite, and that changed the meaning of jewellery forever. What you wore was no longer just about identity or belief. It became a statement of power. Rulers, nobles, and high-ranking figures began to use jewellery as a visual language, one that didn't need explanation. Heavy gold collars, intricate necklaces, and finely crafted rings were not subtle. They were meant to be seen, recognised, and understood instantly. Because in a world where most people owned very little, wearing something rare made you stand out immediately. And standing out in this case meant authority. In ancient Egypt, for example, jewellery was closely tied to hierarchy. Gold, considered the flesh of the gods, was associated with immortality and divine power. The more gold you wore, the closer you appeared to something greater than human. It wasn't just wealth, it was symbolism. And symbolism is powerful, because it shapes how others see you. A ruler adorned with gold and precious stones didn't just look rich. They looked untouchable, elevated, almost otherworldly. And that perception reinforced their position without a single word being spoken. But this wasn't limited to rulers alone. Even within smaller social groups, jewellery began to mark differences. Who had access to certain materials? Who could afford skilled craftsmanship? Who belonged to the upper layers of society? And once those differences became visible, they became permanent. Because unlike temporary displays of wealth, jewellery could be worn constantly. It turned status into something you carried with you, something others could see at any moment. And that visibility mattered. It created boundaries between powerful and powerless, wealthy and poor, elite and ordinary. But perhaps the most interesting part is this: jewellery didn't create power, it revealed it. And once power is visible, it becomes much harder to challenge. Once jewellery became a symbol of power, it didn't lose its earlier meaning. It expanded. Because alongside wealth and status, something older remained woven into every piece: belief. In civilizations like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, jewellery was not just worn to impress others. It was worn to protect, to guide, and sometimes to survive. Because the ancient world was uncertain. Disease, war, natural disasters. Much of life felt unpredictable and often uncontrollable. And when humans face uncertainty, They look for ways to regain control. Jewelry became one of those ways. Amulets and charms began to appear more frequently, each tied to a specific belief or purpose. Some were meant to ward off evil. Others were believed to bring luck, fertility, or health. These weren't decorative choices. They were deeply personal, often tied to fear, hope, and the unknown. In Egypt, for example, protective symbols were carefully crafted and worn close to the body. The ankh represented life. The eye symbol, often associated with protection and watchfulness, was believed to guard against harm. These objects were not worn casually. They were chosen with intention, sometimes even placed on specific parts of the body for maximum effect. And belief didn't stop in life. It extended into death. Jewelry was often buried with the dead, not as decoration, but as preparation. Amulets were placed on bodies to protect the soul in the afterlife, to guide it, to ensure it reached wherever it was meant to go. In some cases, entire sets of jewelry were included, as if the person would continue to need them beyond death. And that tells us something important. These objects were not seen as temporary. They were believed to carry power that extended beyond a single lifetime. Even outside Egypt, similar patterns appear. In Mesopotamia and other early cultures, jewelry was linked to spiritual practices, rituals, and unseen forces. What you wore could influence not just how others saw you, but how the world itself responded to you. Whether those beliefs were true didn't matter. What mattered was the role jewelry played in shaping how people felt. Protected, guided, connected to something larger than themselves. And in that sense, jewelry became more than power. It became reassurance in a world that offered very little of it. Once jewelry became tied to power and belief, another force began to shape its importance even further: distance. Because not all materials could be found everywhere, and the moment something becomes rare in one place but common in another, it gains value. In ancient trade networks stretching across regions like Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and even as far as Indus Valley, jewelry began to carry a new layer of meaning. Not just what it was, but where it came from. A bead made from a local stone was one thing. A bead made from a material that travelled hundreds of miles, that was something else entirely. Materials like lapis lazuli, found in regions far from Mesopotamia, became highly prized not just for their deep blue colour, but for the journey they represented. Shells from distant seas appeared in inland settlements. Precious stones crossed deserts, rivers and mountains to reach the hands of artisans and elites. And every step of that journey added value, because distance meant effort. Effort meant rarity, and rarity meant power. Owning such a piece wasn't just about beauty, it was about access. It showed that you were connected to networks beyond your immediate world, that you had the means, the influence or the relationships required to obtain something others could not. And that changed how jewelry functioned in society. It became a marker not just of who you were, but of how far your reach extended. A necklace could suggest trade connections. A ring could imply wealth tied to distant resources. Even a simple bead could carry the story of travel, exchange, and interaction between cultures that might never meet face to face. This also meant that jewelry became part of something larger than individual identity. It became part of economies. Trade routes expanded, not just for survival goods, but for materials used in adornment. Demand increased. Artisans adapted. Entire systems began to form around the movement of these objects and the materials used to create them. And through all of this, one thing became clear. Jewelry was no longer just personal. It was global, long before the word even existed. Because every piece carried more than meaning, more than status, more than belief. It carried a journey, and in that journey, it connected worlds that would otherwise remain separate. As trade expanded and materials began to travel across vast distances, jewelry gained something even more personal: identity. Because once objects carried meaning, value, and origin, they also began to answer a deeper question. Who are you? In societies across ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, jewelry started to reflect not just status or belief, but belonging. Different groups wore different styles. Materials, shapes, colours, and patterns could signal where someone came from, what role they held, or even what stage of life they were in. A certain type of necklace might indicate adulthood. A specific ornament might show marital status. Another might be tied to a profession or a religious role, and these signals mattered. Because in a world without written identification, jewellery became a visual language, one that could be read instantly. You didn't need to ask someone who they were. You could see it, but identity is never simple, because while jewellery could connect someone to a group, it could also separate them from others. It created boundaries between insiders and outsiders, between those who belonged and those who did not. And those boundaries were not always flexible. Wearing the wrong piece, or imitating a style that didn't belong to you, could be seen as more than a mistake. It could be disrespectful or even dangerous, depending on the culture and context. At the same time, jewellery allowed for individuality within those boundaries. Even within the same group, people could choose how to present themselves, the size of a piece, the combination of materials, the way it was worn. All of these details allowed for subtle differences. So jewellery became something layered. On one level, it told others where you fit. On another, it showed how you chose to express yourself within that place. And this balance between belonging and individuality is something that still exists today. But in the ancient world, it carried even more weight, because your identity was not just social. It could determine your opportunities, your relationships, and your role in the community. And jewellery made that identity visible, not hidden, not explained, but worn openly for the world to see. By this stage, jewellery had become more than decoration, more than status, more than identity. It had become something that could outlive the person who wore it. And that changed its meaning once again. In civilizations like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, jewellery was no longer seen as temporary. It was designed to endure, to pass from one life to another, from one generation to the next. Because if an object carries meaning, why should that meaning end when a life does? This idea is most visible in burial practices. Jewellery was carefully placed with the dead, not as decoration, but as preparation. Rings, amulets, necklaces, each piece chosen with intention, often tied to protection, identity, or spiritual belief. It wasn't about what looked beautiful in death. It was about what remained useful beyond it. And that reveals something powerful. These objects were not just owned. They were trusted. Trusted to protect. Trusted to represent. Trusted to endure. But jewellery didn't just move into the afterlife. It also moved through generations. Pieces were passed down, carrying with them the memory of those who had worn them before. A necklace could belong to a mother, then a daughter. A ring could represent not just wealth, but lineage, continuity, and connection to the past. And over time, that created something even deeper, legacy. Because when an object survives multiple lives, it becomes more than personal. It becomes historical. It carries stories, even if those stories are never written down. At the same time, jewellery began to reflect permanence in another way, through craftsmanship. Artisans created pieces meant to last, using materials and techniques designed to withstand time. The goal was no longer just to create something meaningful in the present, but something that could remain meaningful in the future. And that changes how something is valued, because its worth is no longer tied only to the moment. It's tied to its ability to continue existing beyond it. So jewellery became something unique among human creations. It existed in the present, it carried the past, and it was meant for the future. And in doing so, it turned simple materials, stone, bone, metal, into something far more powerful. Something that could outlast the person who first chose to wear it. From the first shell picked up on a shoreline to the gold worn by kings, the story of ancient jewellery is not just about objects. It's about transformation. What began as simple adornment, beads, bones and stones, slowly evolved into something layered with meaning, power and identity. Early humans didn't know they were creating a tradition that would last thousands of years. They were simply responding to something instinctive, the desire to express, to belong, to be seen. And yet that instinct never disappeared. It only became more complex. In places like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, jewellery turned into a language of power. It showed who ruled, who belonged, who was protected, and who was set apart. It carried belief, status, and connection across generations and across vast distances. But at its core, the purpose remained surprisingly familiar, to communicate something without words. Because whether it was a prehistoric shell necklace or a golden amulet worn by a ruler, the intention was the same. to tell a story about identity, a story about belief, a story about value. And perhaps that's what makes jewellery so enduring. It adapts, but it never loses its essence. Even today, the same patterns remain. We still wear objects that represent who we are, what we believe, and how we want to be seen. The materials may have changed, the designs may be more refined, but the idea is ancient, older than writing, older than cities, older than history itself. And that creates a quiet connection across time, because when you look at a piece of jewellery, any piece, you're not just seeing something decorative. You're seeing the continuation of a human instinct that began tens of thousands of years ago. An instinct to take something from the world and turn it into meaning. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of all. Jewellery was never just about beauty. It was about understanding ourselves and finding a way to carry that understanding with us wherever we go.